Welcome to this deep dive, and we're going deep into Noam Chomsky.
Oh, wow.
You've given us a ton of material, articles, excerpts, all focusing on his book, Optimism Over Despair.
That's a great book.
It is a good title, too. And it seems like you're interested in his thoughts on some really big questions, Is the U.S. in decline? Can we imagine a world beyond capitalism?
Mm.
And how do we even begin to tackle, the threats of climate change and nuclear war?
Yeah, some big ones.
Big questions.
For sure.
Well, I think you've come to the right place to explore these things. So we're going to unpack these complex issues and ideas with the help of our expert, who I think you'll agree has a real knack for connecting the dots and pulling out those so what insights.
I'm ready when you are.
Awesome. All right, so before we get to all the doom and gloom,
Right.
which we will, don't worry.
It's coming.
Yeah, it's coming. I was struck by how Chomsky manages to maintain a sense of optimism throughout all of this.
Right.
That's not easy given the topics he tackles.
Yeah, it's a difficult, it's a tough needle to thread.
It is.
For sure.
Absolutely. So to understand that optimism,
Yeah.
I think we need to start with his critique of the systems that shape our lives.
For sure.
Let's start with his perspective on capitalism, particularly what he calls really existing capitalism.
Right.
He seems pretty skeptical of the whole neoliberal model.
Yeah, he really takes issue with even the term neoliberalism.
Oh, really?
He finds it very misleading.
Ah.
Because it's not really new and it's not very liberal.
Yeah, I mean, wasn't it Reagan and Thatcher back in the 80s who really pushed those free market policies? So we've been living with this for a while now.
Exactly. And Chomsky argues that this system, despite all its talk of free markets, actually relies heavily on government intervention.
Interesting.
Big businesses and the wealthy elite,
Yeah.
they love deregulation.
Of course.
Until they need a bailout, of course.
Right.
It's what he calls the conservative nanny state.
Ah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
So you're saying he sees this really existing capitalism as a system that's built on contradictions. One that claims to champion free markets while constantly turning to the government for favors.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And he points to the consequences of this. The consequences are stark.
Give me an example.
Like the 2008 financial crisis.
Oh, yeah. We all remember that.
Yeah, but he really focuses on how it exemplifies the flaws of the system.
Okay.
The banks engage in this reckless lending, and then they get bailed out by taxpayers.
Right.
But ordinary people are left to deal with the fallout.
Job losses, foreclosure.
All 9 yards, yeah.
The whole 9 yards. It's almost like the system is rigged
Yes.
to protect the powerful, and then the rest of us are just left holding the bag.
It's set up to benefit those at the top.
Right. But, I mean, haven't there been reforms to the financial system since 2008?
Sure, there have been reforms.
So?
But Chomsky would argue they haven't addressed the core problem.
Which is?
Which is this tendency to externalize the costs.
Okay.
Environmental damage from unchecked industrial growth.
Yeah, right.
Social inequality fueled by policies that favor the wealthy.
So instead of fixing the problem, we're just putting on Band-Aids.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And he wants us to see the real human cost of these systemic failures. It's not just about abstract economic figures.
Right.
He brings it back to people.
Give me an example.
Well, remember that $13 billion fine against J.P. Morgan Chase?
I do vaguely.
Yeah, for those fraudulent mortgage schemes? That's a huge number.
It's a huge number.
But it doesn't capture the human cost. The families who lost their homes.
Sure.
The lives upended by these practices.
Okay. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about his analysis of U.S. foreign policy.
Okay.
You've highlighted his view of this recurring pattern of U.S. interventionism around the world.
Yeah.
He really challenges this idea that the U.S. is a force for good on the global stage.
He does. He argues that the U.S. often operates under the guise of spreading democracy. But if we examine the historical record, a very different picture emerges.
He uses the post-World War II interventions as examples.
He does.
In Italy and France. Didn't the U.S. actually undermine left-leaning governments in those countries?
They did?
To install regimes that were more favorable to U.S. business interests?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Chomsky argues that the spread of democracy very often takes a back seat to maintaining U.S. economic and political dominance. And this pattern continues into more recent history.
Right.
Think about the Iraq War, which Chomsky was vehemently opposed to from the beginning.
Right.
Or the ongoing drone assassination program.
Right.
He doesn't mince words.
How did he describe it?
He calls the U.S. the world's leading supporter of terrorism.
Wow. Those are strong words.
They're strong words.
Are there any counter-arguments to that view? I mean, are there ever situations where U.S. intervention might have had a positive impact?
I mean, there are certainly those who would argue that U.S. intervention in certain cases
Right.
has prevented greater humanitarian crises or promoted stability.
Sure.
However, Chomsky would likely counter that. Those are often justifications
Right.
used to mask ulterior motives. And that the long-term consequences of these interventions
Yeah.
are often destabilizing and very harmful.
So for Chomsky, it's all about looking beyond the stated intentions
Yes.
and really examining the actual impacts
For real impact.
of that foreign policy.
Yes. And those impacts are often devastating, both for the people in the countries being intervened in and for the U.S. itself in terms of its global reputation and the erosion of its own democratic values.
Okay. This brings us to another area where you've highlighted his concerns.
Okay.
The existential threats that are facing humanity.
Yeah.
He seems particularly worried about climate change and nuclear proliferation.
He does. He sees them as the most urgent dangers.
Wow.
You know, the shadows that loom over everything we consider, as he puts it. And when it comes to climate change,
Yeah.
he doesn't just call out the deniers.
Right.
He points the finger at a major U.S. political party
Wow.
for actively blocking any meaningful action.
So he finds it astounding that in one of the wealthiest, most educated nations on Earth, a significant portion of the political establishment is still denying the
Yes.
overwhelming scientific consensus on climate change.
He does, and he actually delves into the cultural factors
Wow.
that contribute to this. He highlights the dominance of short-term business interests and the influence of religious fundamentalism.
So he's saying there's this belief that if God is in control, then we shouldn't worry about climate change.
Yeah, you see this idea in some circles.
But isn't that a bit of a generalization? I mean, surely not everyone who has religious beliefs is dismissive of climate change.
Of course not. And Chomsky isn't suggesting that all religious people are climate change deniers.
Okay.
But he does argue that certain strains of religious fundamentalism, particularly those that emphasize a very literal interpretation of Scripture,
Right.
can create a worldview that is incompatible with accepting the scientific consensus.
It's almost like they're saying that the science is a threat to their faith.
Yeah, in a way, yes. And that can lead to a situation where ideology trumps evidence and where political decisions are based on beliefs rather than on facts.
So that's a pretty scary thought.
It is.
We're living in a world where facts themselves are up for debate.
Exactly. And that's a concern that Chomsky has expressed repeatedly. He sees this erosion of trust in scientific expertise and the rise of misinformation as a serious threat to our ability to address the complex challenges facing humanity.
Yeah.
It really undermines our ability to even agree on what's real and what's true.
Right. And how can we even begin to solve problems if we can't agree on what the problems are?
Yeah, exactly. It's a recipe for inaction and paralysis and ultimately for disaster.
Okay, so let's bring this back to his analysis of climate change.
Okay.
He doesn't just point a finger at climate change deniers, does he?
No, he doesn't. He also critiques those who acknowledge the problem
Right.
but fail to take adequate action.
Okay.
He's especially critical of what he sees as the hypocrisy of political leaders and corporations that pay lip service to environmental concerns, while continuing to prioritize profits over the health of the planet.
So it's like they're saying, yes, climate change is a problem, but let's not do anything that might hurt our bottom line.
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate summary of his critique.
Okay.
He argues that the current economic system, with its emphasis on endless growth and consumption,
Right.
is fundamentally incompatible with addressing the climate crisis.
So it's not just about individual choices like recycling or driving less.
Right.
It's about the system itself.
But the system itself.
Yeah.
He argues we need a fundamental shift in our economic priorities, a move away from a growth-based
Yeah.
model
Right.
towards a more sustainable and equitable system.
But isn't that kind of unrealistic? Can we really just overturn the entire global economic system?
It's a daunting challenge for sure.
It is.
But Chomsky argues that we have no choice.
Because...
The consequences of inaction are just too dire.
Right.
He points to the growing scientific consensus on the severity of the crisis.
Yeah.
And these increasingly frequent extreme weather events as evidence that we are really running out of time.
So for him, it's not a matter of if we change, but how we change. And he believes that the how is just as important as the what.
Yes. He believes we need to ensure that the process of change itself is democratic, participatory, and just.
Okay. So let's talk about what that process might look like. What concrete steps does he propose for addressing these threats?
Well, he's not one to offer like a simple solution or
Right.
a step-by-step plan.
Okay.
He sees social change as this complex and messy process
Okay.
that requires experimentation, adaptation, and constant struggle.
Sure.
But he does offer some guiding principles.
Okay. Like what?
Well, he emphasizes the importance of building grassroots movements,
Okay.
empowering communities, and challenging corporate power.
Okay.
He sees the potential for transformative change in these growing global movements
Yeah.
for climate justice, social justice, and economic equality.
So it's about building power from the bottom up.
Yes.
Creating a counterforce to the concentrated power of corporations and the wealthy elite.
Exactly. He believes that real change comes from the collective action of ordinary people,
Right.
not from top-down solutions imposed by governments or corporations.
That's a powerful message.
It is.
It's a reminder that we're not powerless,
Yes.
that we have agency, and that we can make a difference.
Absolutely. And that's where Chomsky's optimism really shines through.
Yeah.
You know, he sees the potential for positive change
Yeah.
in the countless acts of resistance,
Right.
the grassroots movements, and the individuals who are working to create a more just and equitable world.
So for Chomsky, the source of hope lies in the people
Yes.
who are actively working to create a better future.
Yes.
Even in the face of these seemingly insurmountable odds.
Precisely.
Yeah.
He sees those efforts, those acts of courage and compassion, as proof that another world is possible.
Yeah.
And that's a powerful message of hope, even amidst all the darkness.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of, heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But amidst all the doom and gloom, you've also pointed out that he maintains this surprising sense of optimism.
He does.
Can we dig into where that optimism comes from?
Absolutely. Chomsky's optimism is rooted in his belief in human nature.
Okay.
He doesn't see us as inherently greedy or selfish.
Right.
He actually believes we have an innate capacity for cooperation, empathy, and creativity.
So he's not buying into that whole human nature is inherently flawed argument?
Not at all.
Yeah.
He sees those sorts of arguments as justifying the very systems of power and oppression he critiques.
So the problem isn't human nature itself.
Right.
It's the structures that we've created
Yes.
that distort and suppress our better instincts.
Precisely.
So he's saying that capitalism, with its emphasis on competition and individual gain, actually goes against our natural inclination toward cooperation and community.
That's a key part of his critique.
Yes.
He believes that if we can create a more just and equitable society, one that actually supports our innate capacity for cooperation, then we can unleash human potential in ways we can't even imagine right now.
This part about actually existing socialism is interesting. I'm curious to hear more about the distinction he draws between that and his ideal of worker control.
Yeah.
It feels like he's saying that the socialist experiments of the past have failed to live up to their promise.
You've hit the nail on the head there. He argues that what we've seen in the past, those authoritarian state capitalist regimes, those weren't true expressions of socialist ideals. He points to grassroots movements and worker-owned enterprises as glimpses of what a genuine socialist society could actually look like.
So you're saying he sees those movements as a kind of prefigurative politics.
Yes.
They're not just fighting for change.
Right.
They're modeling the kind of world they want to create.
Exactly. And that's where his optimism really shines through. He sees those examples, even within this flawed system, as proof that another way of living, of organizing, of relating to each other is possible.
Okay. So it's not about waiting for some grand revolution.
Yeah.
It's about building the new world within the shell of the old.
Exactly. And for Chomsky, that process of building, of resisting, of creating alternatives is where hope resides.
Okay. So let's talk about what that active engagement might look like.
Okay.
You've mentioned his emphasis on activism, but what specific forms of activism does he advocate for?
Well, he's a strong believer in the power of collective action.
Okay.
You know, he sees it as the only way to counter the concentrated power of corporations and the wealthy elite.
Right.
And he doesn't limit this to traditional forms of activism like protests or demonstrations.
Right.
He talks about the importance of education, of raising awareness, and of changing the dominant narrative.
So it's not just about taking to the streets.
No.
It's about changing minds and hearts.
Exactly. He sees that battle for hearts and minds as just as important as the battle for political and economic power.
Okay. But how do we actually go about changing those deeply ingrained narratives? I mean, we're bombarded with propaganda and misinformation from all sides.
We are. It's overwhelming.
It is overwhelming.
And that's why Chomsky emphasizes the importance of critical thinking,
Right.
of questioning assumptions, and developing the skills to deconstruct those dominant narratives.
So becoming more media literate?
Yes, more aware of the techniques that are used to manipulate and persuade.
So it's about becoming more skeptical, more discerning consumers of information.
Exactly. He's not saying we should reject everything we hear or read,
Right.
but he is encouraging us to be more critical, to ask questions, and to demand evidence.
So instead of passively accepting what we're told,
Yeah.
we should be actively questioning
Yes,
and
sir.
challenging those narratives.
Precisely. And that's where the real power lies. It's in our ability to think for ourselves, to form our own opinions, and to resist the forces that are trying to control our minds.
This is where it gets really interesting.
It does.
Because it's not enough to simply be critical.
Right.
We also need to be constructive.
Yes.
We need to offer alternative narratives, imagine different possibilities, and work towards creating a better world.
Exactly. It's not just about tearing down the old.
Right.
It's about building something new.
Okay. And that's where his vision really shines through. He's not just a critic, he's a builder.
Yes.
He's someone who believes in the power of human ingenuity and creativity
Yes.
to solve problems and to create a more just and sustainable world.
He does.
But is that vision realistic? Given all the challenges we face, can we really expect to create a radically different world?
Chomsky would argue that we have no choice. The current system is unsustainable both ecologically and socially. We need to find another way of living, of relating to each other, and of organizing our societies.
So for him, it's not a matter of if we change, but how we change.
Exactly. And he believes that the how is just as important as the what. We need to ensure that the process of change itself is democratic, participatory, and just.
Okay, so let's talk about what those alternative systems might look like. You've mentioned his explorations of socialism and anarchism,
Yeah.
but those ideologies have often been associated with utopian thinking, with unrealistic ideals that can't be implemented in the real world. How does Chomsky address those critiques?
He acknowledges that there have been historical examples of socialist and anarchist experiments that haven't lived up to their ideals,
Right.
but he argues that those failures don't invalidate the underlying principles.
Okay.
He sees those principles, social justice, equality, democratic participation, and ecological sustainability as essential for building a better world.
So it's not about clinging to a specific ideology or dogma.
Right.
It's about using those principles as a guide for creating a more just and equitable society.
Exactly. He's not advocating for like a rigid blueprint or a one-size-fits-all solution.
No.
He's encouraging us to think creatively, to experiment, and to find solutions that work for our specific contexts.
That sounds a lot more pragmatic than the stereotype of the radical revolutionary.
It is. He's definitely not afraid to challenge the status quo,
Right.
but he's also deeply committed to finding practical solutions to real-world problems. He's a thinker and a doer, someone who combines intellectual rigor with a passion for social justice.
Okay, but realistically, how much can we expect to achieve? I mean, the systems he critiques are so vast and powerful.
They are.
It can feel like we're up against an insurmountable force.
Chomsky wouldn't downplay the challenges.
Right.
He acknowledges that the forces we're up against are immense. But he also points out that throughout history, seemingly insurmountable systems of power have been overthrown by popular movements.
Right.
He reminds us that change is possible, but it requires sustained effort, collective action, and a refusal to give up hope.
So it's about recognizing the magnitude of the challenges.
Yes.
While also believing in our own power to create change.
Exactly. He's not offering easy solutions or quick fixes.
Yeah.
He's calling for a long-term commitment to struggle, to resistance, and to building a better world.
But isn't that a little bit discouraging? It sounds like a never-ending battle against forces that are always going to be more powerful than us.
It can feel that way at times.
Yeah.
But Chomsky would argue that the struggle itself is meaningful, that the act of resisting injustice and striving for a better world is a worthwhile endeavor, even if we don't see immediate results.
So it's not just about the destination, it's about the journey.
Exactly. And he finds hope in the very act of resistance, in the knowledge that people are willing to stand up for what they believe in, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds.
That's a powerful message. It's a reminder that even small acts of resistance can make a difference.
They can.
That our individual choices can contribute to a collective movement for change.
Yes, and that's where his optimism really shines through. He believes that human beings have an innate capacity for good,
Okay.
that we're capable of creating a more just and equitable world. but it's up to us to make it happen.
Okay, so we've talked about his critiques of the systems that govern our lives, his
Yeah.
exploration of alternative possibilities, and his
Okay.
call to action.
Yes.
What about his own personal life?
Okay.
What kind of a person is he outside of his public persona?
Well, from what I've read, he's known for his humility, his work ethic, and his unwavering commitment to social justice.
Okay.
He lives a relatively modest life, avoids the trappings of fame, and dedicates much of his time to writing, teaching, and speaking out against injustice.
It sounds like he's not interested in personal gain or self-promotion.
Right.
He's truly driven by a desire to make the world a better place.
That's the impression I get.
Yeah.
He's a man of principle, a dedicated activist, and a tireless advocate for social justice.
Yeah.
Someone who puts his ideas into action and lives by the values he espouses.
I find that very inspiring. It's easy to become cynical and disillusioned in the face of so much injustice and suffering in the world. But Chomsky seems to have maintained his faith in humanity and his belief in the possibility of positive change.
He has, and he inspires others to do the same.
Yeah.
He shows us that it's possible to live a life of purpose and meaning, to stand up for what you believe in, and to fight for a better world.
Okay, but he's not without his flaws, right? I mean, no one's perfect.
Of course.
He's been criticized for being too dogmatic, too inflexible, even too arrogant at times.
It's true. He can be fiercely critical of those who disagree with him.
Yeah.
He's not known for his patience with what he sees as intellectual dishonesty or bad faith arguments.
Okay.
And some do find his tone off-putting or his style overly confrontational.
Sure.
But I think it's important to remember that he's been fighting for social justice for over 6 decades.
That's a long time.
It is. He's seen firsthand the brutality and injustice of the systems that he critiques.
Right.
So it's understandable that he might be impatient with those who defend or perpetuate those systems.
So his anger, his frustration, it comes from a place of deep conviction.
Yes.
And a sense of urgency.
Exactly. He sees the world as being on a precipice, facing these existential threats that require urgent action. And he's not afraid to call out those who he sees as standing in the way of progress.
Okay, but isn't there a danger in being too strident, too uncompromising? Doesn't it risk alienating potential allies and making dialogue and compromise more difficult?
That's a valid concern. And it's true that Chomsky's uncompromising approach has sometimes made it difficult for him to build bridges with those who hold different views.
Sure.
But he argues that there's a greater danger in being too accommodating and softening critiques in order to appease those in power.
Right.
He believes that real change requires a willingness to speak truth to power, even if it means being unpopular.
So he's willing to sacrifice popularity for the sake of principle.
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment. He's not interested in winning popularity contests. He's interested in challenging injustice and promoting a more equitable world. And he believes that sometimes that requires a willingness to be confrontational, to call out hypocrisy, and to refuse to compromise on fundamental principles.
Okay, so we've explored Chomsky's critiques of the systems that govern our lives,
We have.
his exploration of alternative possibilities, and his call to action.
Yes.
What about his legacy?
His legacy.
What impact do you think his work will have on future generations?
I believe Chomsky's work will continue to inspire and challenge people for generations to come. His insights into power, propaganda, and the human condition are timeless and universal.
So his work is like a beacon of hope for those who are struggling for a better world.
Exactly. He shows us that it's possible to think critically, to speak truth to power, and to never give up hope in the face of adversity.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really undermines our ability to even agree on what's real, what's true.
Right. And how can we even begin to solve problems if we can't agree on what the problems are?
Exactly. It's a recipe for inaction, for paralysis, and ultimately for disaster.
Okay, so let's bring this back to his analysis of climate change.
Okay.
He doesn't just point a finger at climate change deniers, does he?
No, he doesn't. He also critiques those who acknowledge the problem,
Right.
but fail to take adequate action to really address it.
Okay.
He's particularly critical of what he sees as the hypocrisy of political leaders and corporations.
Okay.
They're the ones who pay lip service to environmental concerns, but then continue to prioritize profit over the health of the planet.
It's like they're saying, yes, climate change is a problem, but let's not do anything that might hurt our bottom line.
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate summary of his critique.
Okay.
He argues that the current economic system, with its emphasis on endless growth and consumption,
Right.
is fundamentally incompatible with addressing the climate crisis.
So it's not just about individual choices like recycling or driving less.
No.
It's about the system itself.
It's about the system itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. He argues we need a fundamental shift in our economic priorities.
Oh, okay.
A move away from a growth-based model
Right.
towards a more sustainable and equitable system.
But isn't that kind of unrealistic? Can we really just overturn the entire global economic system?
It's a daunting challenge for sure.
Yeah, it is.
But Chomsky argues that we have no choice.
Okay.
The consequences of inaction are just too dire.
Right.
He points to the growing scientific consensus on the severity of the crisis
Yeah.
and these increasingly frequent extreme weather events as evidence that we're really running out of time.
So he's saying it's not a matter of if we change, but how we change.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he believes that the how is just as important as the what. We need to ensure that the process of change itself is democratic, participatory, and just.
Okay. So let's talk about what that process might look like.
Yeah.
What concrete steps does he propose for addressing these threats?
Well, he's not one to offer like a simple solution or a step-by-step plan.
Okay.
He sees social change as this complex and messy process that requires experimentation, adaptation, and constant struggle.
Okay.
But he does offer some guiding principles.
Okay. Like what?
Well, he emphasizes the importance of building grassroots movements,
Okay.
empowering communities, and challenging corporate power.
Right.
He sees the potential for transformative change in these growing global movements
Yeah.
for climate justice, social justice, and economic equality.
So it's about building power from the bottom up,
Yes.
creating a counterforce to the concentrated power
Yeah,
of corporations and the wealthy elite.
exactly. He believes that real change comes from the collective action of ordinary people,
Right.
not from top-down solutions imposed by governments or corporations.
That's a powerful message.
It is.
It's a reminder that we're not powerless.
Yes.
That we have agency.
You do.
And that we can make a difference.
Absolutely. And that's where Chomsky's optimism really shines through. He sees the potential for positive change
Yeah.
in the countless acts of resistance,
Right.
the grassroots movements, and the individuals who are working to create a more just and equitable world.
So for Chomsky, the source of hope lies in the people who are actively working to create a better future,
Yes.
even in the face of these seemingly insurmountable odds.
Precisely. He sees those efforts, those acts of courage and compassion as proof that another world is possible.
Yeah.
And that's a powerful message of hope, even amidst all the darkness.
Well, it's been quite a journey exploring these ideas.
It is. Chomsky certainly gives us a lot to think about.
He does. And I think that's one of his greatest strengths. He's not just offering answers. He's asking questions.
Challenging us.
Yeah, he's challenging us to think critically, to examine our own assumptions, and to engage with the world in a more meaningful way.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah. So I think the big takeaway here is that his work is ultimately a call to action.
It is. He's urging us to become engaged citizens, to inform ourselves, to organize, and to fight for the kind of world that we want to live in.
He's not offering us easy solutions or guarantees of success, but he is offering a challenge, a call to awaken to the possibilities of collective action and the potential for positive change.
And that's a message that resonates deeply, especially in these times of uncertainty and upheaval. It's a reminder that we have the power to shape our own destiny, but only if we're willing to step up and do the work.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Noam Chomsky. We hope you found it enlightening, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
And we encourage you to continue exploring Chomsky's work and to find your own ways to engage with the ideas and challenges he presents.
Until next time, keep diving deep.